So, welcome. I'm Kristine West. I'm the moderator for today's session and also one of the presenters. Really excited to be here because I'm actually not a cartographer. I'm an economist by training. And my colleague Rachel here is a historian. So I feel like there's some joke here about like an economist and a historian walk into a cartography conference and like, I don't know what the punchline is yet. Let's hope it's that like hilarity ensues. We did bring some GIS master's students with us here today as well. And we do have a map, so I feel like that gives us entree into a cartography conference. And so the map we're going to be talking about today is a map that was built by the team at Mapping Prejudice. I find it somewhat mesmerizing to look at, so I put it on loop here for us at the start. Also, a hearty welcome to the Twin Cities, since I know many of you are not from here, but we are. We are local. Jake and Emily are at the University of Minnesota, and Rachel and I are at a university called St. Catherine University, which is a women's college over in St. Paul. And so we locate ourselves on this map and have been doing work in the community to help people that we live and work with also locate themselves on this map. So we're going to tell you today is a little bit of the story. I forgot I'm supposed to take my mask off. We're going to tell you a little bit of the story about the map and the technical piece of it. But the pitch for the talk was actually to also really think about the interdisciplinary work that's happening around the map. So that I will be talking more about like what it's like to be an economist involved in this work. And Rachel's going to tee us up with some great historical context as well. So I won't steal anybody's thunder, but as moderator, I do want to start with the land acknowledgement that comes from the conference, the 42nd annual meeting of the North American Cartographic Information Society is occurring on the traditional land of the Dakota people. And we respectfully acknowledge that this is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of many indigenous peoples. The board of directors pledges the society's support for the return and control of indigenous homelands, with an annual donation to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which is actually located here in Minneapolis. And I just want to echo, like I said, since we are local, we are doing work. The map that we are building is about this land as well. And you know, it is obviously a story of erasure, because you're going to see that we're going to talk about how this land is being divvied up and bought and sold after it's already been taken from indigenous populations. And we're going to refer to like Ramsey County and Hennepin County, and just little piece of local lore. These are, of course, white supremacist names for these counties that reference conquerors of the land, so to speak. We're also going to talk today very explicitly about systemic racism. So ours is a map about white supremacy and racism, specifically about housing discrimination, both past and present. We're going to include primary source documents. You will see that these primary source documents use derogatory language. In fact, that's what we're mapping, is derogatory language. It was commonplace at the time, but it's important to confront this history, and so we are going to show that text unedited, but we've made a decision as a team that we're not going to voice the hurtful language whenever possible. We'll just pause and let you read it. And we would ask that you would consider doing the same so that we can stay focused on the work of the map rather than the language. So, oops, that goes back to the pretty map. We're going to talk to you today about racial covenants here in the Twin Cities. This is the team of experts that I brought with me, and I'm going to actually just let Rachel take it from here, and I'm going to slip into moderator mode. Rachel, you have the clicker.
All right. Let's see. All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Rachel Neiwert. I'm an associate professor of history at St. Catherine University, and I'm really excited to be here with you this afternoon. Oh, that's backwards still too. There we go. So just to give you a sense of where we're headed today, I'm going to provide a brief overview of where we're going today, and then I'll provide a little bit of a historical context and background to what is happening here in the Twin Cities that leads to the map. Then Jake is going to take over to talk a little bit about the technical workflow and how it is that the map itself comes to be. And then Emily will take over to talk a bit about humans and the data and the kinds of community engagement work we've been doing in this project. And Kristine will finish us off by talking about some of the interdisciplinary lessons, and then hopefully we should have time for some good questions and conversations at the end of our time together. So as we sort of head into the presentation, just to give you a sense of what some of our key points are. So the work that we've been doing together, the Mapping Prejudice project at the University of Minnesota, and then the Welcoming the Dear Neighbor project at St. Catherine University, is an interdisciplinary project. And we think this interdisciplinarity actually creates a lot of the power in the work that we're doing, that we all bring our different disciplinary lenses to inform our interpretation of the map. It's also a project that's largely about community engagement. So when I think about my contribution as a historian, I think about the work that I'm doing really more from a lens of public history, right? So this isn't intended just to be work for other scholars. It's intended to be work that has impact in our communities. We also think there's power. Part of what our project shows is the power of the data in terms of storytelling. That, right, we all bring different data to the table, maps. Kristine has some lovely regressions to show you. I have stories from the past. But, right, it's that collectively when we put this all together, we can tell a full and interesting picture that brings together both quantitative and qualitative perspectives. And we're all going to start by telling you a little bit about who we are personally, because I also think it's work that really requires us to think about our personal position in relationship to it. So I am a historian by training, but not actually even a US historian. I'm actually a British historian. When I wear my British history hat, I study children and education in the British Empire, and I'm interested in questions of national identity and citizenship, particularly how children understood those things. I came to this project and this work because St. Kate's was working with the Mapping Prejudice project to bring their work to Ramsey County. And at St. Kate's, they wanted a historian to be involved, and I volunteered. I was looking for an opportunity to engage my students in research, which isn't as common, I think, in history as it is in some other disciplines. But the cool part of historical research is getting to be in the archives, right, and like touching and seeing all of these documents. And I can't take my students to Britain, but I can take them down the street to the Minnesota Historical Society. So that brought me to this work. And admittedly, it comes with a pretty steep learning curve for me. So I think I'm as much a learner as a scholar when I'm working on this project. The other thing I will say about my positionality in relationship to this work is, so I'm a white middle-class woman. I live in a house. My husband and I bought a house. It's the second house we've bought in our lives together. And I have to say, when we moved to the Twin Cities in 2004 and we bought our first house together, what I understood about that experience is that there were limitations to that experience, right? And the limitation was how much money we had, right? How much house could we afford? But I pretty much understood in 2004 when we were buying that first house that that was like the only limitation. And I naively assumed that that was how house buying worked for everybody else. But perhaps my first clue that that is not how it worked for everybody else should have been when I contacted the realtor we were going to work with from Georgia, where we were living at the time. And she said, send me a list of houses that you're interested in seeing when you get here. And we sent her a list. And she called us back and she said, well, if you really insist, I'll take you and show you those houses. But you might want to go back and find some different ones. And, we were living a lot of states away and didn't know anybody here. And so we just assumed, well, okay, I guess, I don't know why, but I guess we should look somewhere else. What I subsequently learned once we lived here is that all the initial houses we'd sent her, because price was our limitation, were all homes in North Minneapolis. And she didn't want to show them to us because she thought somehow that was not a desirable neighborhood to live in. But that, of course, perpetuates what is the problem that we're here to talk about, the ways that race and privilege influence who can and can't live where. So that's a little bit about me. So if we think about homeownership from the perspective very particularly of the Twin Cities, the Twin Cities so often comes up as a place that's like the best place to live by a whole variety of metrics, right? Because of jobs, because of parks, because of schools, because of all kinds of different things. But if you cut almost all of those statistics by race, the picture becomes much more complex. So if you look at home ownership, for example, the Twin Cities have one of the highest share of residents that own their own home. But again, if you cut that data and look at it more particularly in terms of race, in fact, what we have is the largest racial disparity in home ownership really in the United States. So approximately 75% of white families own their own home in the Twin Cities. Only 25% of black families own their own home in the Twin Cities. And this 50% gap is one of the largest in the United States. And so when we talk about the Twin Cities as being one of the best places in the United States to live, what we actually mean is that the Twin Cities are one of the best places in the United States to live for white people and one of the worst places in the United States by almost every statistical measure for people of color. And as a historian, when I try to take up the question of why is this so, where does this disparity come from, for me the answer lies in the past. And so I have spent the last few years with my students working my way through newspapers day by day to try to identify the story, right, the narrative of housing inequity and racism in the Twin Cities. And here in the Twin Cities, I think the story that most people are familiar with is what happens to the Rondo neighborhood. So the Rondo neighborhood was a historically black neighborhood in St. Paul. It's actually a fairly integrated neighborhood as well. But it was the neighborhood where there was a large proportion of the black community in St. Paul lived there. And in the 1950s, I-94, which is the interstate that connects the two cities, was built through the middle of the Rondo community, utterly devastating it and dividing it, right? And when I give presentations here in the Twin Cities to community groups, people are familiar with the Rondo story. But I think what happens is that they imagine that story, that is the story of racism and home inequity. That that's it. It just goes in that little box and there aren't stories. What I found with my students going through newspapers, in fact, that the real story is that there is a persistent and consistent effort to claim more and more spaces for white people and push people of color into smaller and smaller neighborhoods. And this starts, I think, this isn't the first story, but I think this is a crucial sort of turning point. So I thought I would tell you this story. So this image here comes from a newspaper in May of 1909. This is from the Pioneer Press. This is a home, it's a duplex on Lincoln Avenue in the Crocus Hill neighborhood. So at the time, this was not the nicest neighborhood in the Twin Cities. It's not the neighborhood of sort of big mansions along Summit if you live here, but it's not far off from that. This was a pretty solidly middle class neighborhood at the time. And this particular home in 1909 was owned by an African-American dentist, Dr. Bell. He didn't live in the home. It had 2 apartments, one upstairs, one down, and he rented the home out. He had a local agent who took care of the home. The home in 1909 rents to 2 African-American families. So it's a family with children that live on the lower floor. On the top floor is a woman by the name of Mrs. Jackson, who the newspapers are a little fuzzy about. Some of them report her to be a widower. Some of them report her to be married, but that her husband travels for work, so she's alone often. And most of the newspaper stories I found report that she's an invalid, so that she has a nurse who lives with her. When these 2 families move into this duplex on Lincoln Avenue in 1909, they are the first African-American people to move into this neighborhood. And their white neighbors were not happy. The white neighbors formed a neighborhood association and hosted a series of indignation meetings, which are exactly what they sound like, meetings where everybody got together and shared what they were angry about and how they thought they could solve their problems. And what they were angry about was that these two African American families had moved into their neighborhood. They suggest many solutions to their particular problem. So they try to buy the house from Dr. Bell. That's their first effort, is to see if they can buy him out of the neighborhood. He refuses to sell. The neighbors complain that he says he names a price and says he will sell for a price, but the neighbors complain and say that the price is so high that they think he deliberately moved African American families in the neighborhood just so that he could demand a lot of money for his home. They engage in acts of violence and harassment, the white neighbors, against the two black families live in the home. So they throw rocks at the windows, they ring the doorbells at all hours of the day and night. In fact, one newspaper actually reports that one evening, the white neighbors actually dim the street lights that they had at the time so that under the cover of darkness, they can cause further damage and harm to this home and, scare the people who are living there. And in fact, quite openly in the newspapers at one of these indignation meetings, someone actually suggests that perhaps the solution to their problem is to have a lynching, right? And now someone else in the same newspaper story says, well, wait, the suggestion of a lynching wasn't really serious, it was only a joke. I don't actually think that makes it better, right? But it's another place where I think the way we tell our history is so critical. Because, if I am not thinking hard, if I am just being a lazy thinker, it's easy to imagine that the kinds of conversations that these white neighbors were having, right, that are openly reported in the newspaper, it's easy to imagine that these are conversations that would have happened in Georgia, in Mississippi, in Alabama. But of course, they're not conversations that happened in those places. There are conversations that happened, this is a little bit farther than I could probably walk from my office at St. Kate's, but not too much farther. This is probably a 10-minute drive from the place that I go every day to do my work, right? And this is the history of the place that we live. This story seems so critical to me because when I look at newspapers, I don't see, prior to 1909, and this doesn't mean that it isn't there, it just means in terms of what we found so far, because turning the sort of microfilm day by day through newspaper reels is quite a slow process. But this seems to be a story that presented something of a turning point. The black population in the Twin Cities in 1909, it's not very large, but it is nonetheless growing and in some ways really starting to thrive. And it's as though all of a sudden the white people realized, oh no, things could change. And so now they need a new plan of what to do to keep their neighborhoods white. And so here the solution that they turn to are racial covenants. So I've put an example of a racial covenant up here on the screen. I'll let you read it because the language is not the language, of course, that we would use today. A racial covenant is simply language that's added to a housing deed that said that only white people could live in this particular home. And in the early 20th century, racial covenants were particularly strong tools by which white people could claim space for white people because the covenant runs with the land. It's not dependent on the person who owns the home, right? It just stays with the home no matter who lives there. And it's important, I think, to note, too, that racial covenants aren't secret. In fact, they're selling points. So Como Park, which is a pretty large and famous park here in the Twin Cities, and Kristine is actually going to talk a little bit more about Como Park in her presentation. As the Como Park neighborhood is being developed in the early part of the 20th century, Thomas Frankson, who is developing half of the neighborhood, really, he runs advertisements in the newspapers where he says, and here's why you should buy a home in my neighborhood, There are many reasons, including how they're going to deal with their gravel and things like that. But he finally concludes that one of the reasons, fourth, is that the grantee cannot sell or lease real estate to any person of color, right? This isn't a secret, it's a selling feature. They wrote it out in the newspapers. And I would argue it's also the way, to the extent that we might say that redlining was successful, which is terrible, right, that it succeeds at what it's trying to accomplish. Redlining is based on the neighborhood divisions that racial covenants had already created in communities all across the United States, but certainly here in the Twin Cities as well, right? So part of what I see here is the nimbleness of racism, right? It starts with neighborhood violence and efforts to buy people out. That continues, but then they develop another tool, racial covenants, that can let them keep neighborhoods as white spaces. Redlining sort of maps on top of that to further claim spaces as white spaces. As racial covenants become illegal, right, I think the move is to zoning, right, looking at zoning laws as new ways, right, zoning becomes a proxy for race. So the historical sort of narrative that I think informs the work is a consistent pattern here in the Twin Cities for white people to claim spaces for other white people, right? This is the consistent effort. And also the nimbleness of racism, the nimbleness of tools that folks have to do that work. So historians had certainly been talking about racial covenants. That racial covenants existed wasn't new news, but historians didn't have tools to see the extent of racial covenants. And this is really the remarkable work that Mapping Prejudice brings to us, is a method and a tool by which you can see holistically across a community where racial covenants are. And it's terrible, but also really exciting to be able to see and then think about what you can do. So I'm going to turn things over to Jake now.
Thank you, Rachel. Right, so first I'll introduce myself. I'm, what does this little clicker do here? Let's see, is this one forward? Let's find out. Nope. That's the one I want. First I'll introduce myself a little bit. Jake Ford. I'm a Mapping Prejudice research assistant and Master of Geographic Information Science student at the University of Minnesota. And as we kind of talk about our own histories and the interdisciplinary kind of approaches, like what we all bring to this project, I've got a history here at in Minnesota and at the university. A long while ago, I got my undergraduate degree in theater, believe it or not. So this is an image of me with a production of Hamlet with a company out in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Had a good career and a good thing going there. And a while back I went on a long hike with my father and kind of realized, well, maybe I wanted to explore some other fields and some other options. So with that in my mind, I was keeping kind of an eye out in the world of conservation and trail maintenance work, and I saw this job posting for a GIS program manager at the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, and I was super excited about some of the language here, right? Being creating accurate cartographic products and interfacing with the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and that got me really excited. So the next thing I did was Google, what is GIS? And fortunately for me, I was living here in Minnesota at the time, and the University of Minnesota's Master of Geographic Information Science program kind of popped up, and that was my window into the world of what GIS is and what modern kind of mapping and cartography and data analysis is like. And that's what brings me to this spot where I start working with Mapping Prejudice as a research assistant. Now, they seem like kind of disparate interests, right? But the thread that is tying these, that ties these two kind kind of career paths together is this idea of narrative and storytelling, right? So one of the important things that Mapping Prejudice does is kind of uncover these personal narrative histories, these community narrative histories. So maps and these geovisualizations, right, are powerful storytelling tools. And they allow you to put these points, the objects, the fields, the events, and to some extent the people into places, and then you can begin to explore the relationships between them. So those data-driven kind of personal community historical narratives really are the core of the mission of Mapping Prejudice. So I'm going to talk about that first part of the equation, which is the data creation and the data wrangling, before I hand things off to my colleague Emily. So just kind of talk a little bit here about creating the data set. As Rachel mentioned, the historians have known about racial covenants and studied them to some extent. And of course, communities affected by the racist practices are aware of the use of racial covenants, and the history of resistance against them goes back to their earliest implementation, right? They're not secret, they're not made in silence without any protest. But as Rachel mentioned as well, Mapping Prejudice's kind of big innovation is to leverage the new kind of computer technology and the engaged communities of citizen researchers to produce and process the covenants and map them at scale. So how do we do that? This is the big result, kind of the big picture of what we get out of the whole thing. And this is another image of the map that we had at the beginning. And each one of these points represents a covenant that we've identified and the lot that it pertains to. And each one of those clusters are neighborhoods with dozens, hundreds even of covenants. And you can see immediately, just by putting them in space, a story starts to emerge. We start to give them context. You can see that ring pattern kind of start to take place around the center of the cities, which corresponds roughly to this outward development of history that Rachel was talking about for the establishment of the first ring suburbs. And then once you have this data spatialized, right, you can start to pull in other data and start exploring those relationships and dig out the stories and generate meaning, real meaning in history from these points. So getting to those points, right, that data, that underlying information, how do we get to it? So this is a little workflow, high-level overview of kind of how we did it for Hennepin County, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we've changed some things for Ramsey County and for our upcoming partners in Milwaukee County. This is a process that Kevin Ehrman Solberg designed. And at a very high level, this is kind of still the process that we use. So first we get our access to the documents. In this case, this would be with Hennepin County as the partnership there. And you can download those documents and run them through a OCR process with a simple Python script. And OCR is basically, we just get images, which are just pictures of digital pictures of the documents, and the OCR process takes the text out of that and identifies the text. So then you can pair text with the image and move on to the next phase, where we can search that text for some of the racially restrictive language and the racist language that would occur there. And those parameters in that second step there are set by the researchers from experience, working with hundreds and in some of our cases, thousands of these documents. So there's a manual input in that process. And in that flagging step, we create kind of a subset of the documents that are identified as potential candidates for having racial covenants. And this is where the citizen scientist crowdsourcing part comes in. We can upload that set of documents to a Zooniverse workflow, which is a whole kind of separate part and very essential part of what we do at Mapping Prejudice, which Emily's going to get into. But we upload the documents there, and volunteers do a direct transcription process. They get to go interact with the original documents and transcribe, look through the documents, confirm that there is a racial covenant there, transcribe the information, and this is how we get identify the geographic location of these documents. So this is kind of the first part, right? We then grab all of the Zooniverse information, and each document has been reviewed by at least 5 of the volunteers through this web flow. And once we get all that information, we can do a kind of a complicated process of cleaning up that data, bringing all of this information back together, and searching for or getting the optimum terms and searching out data with, I guess, like broken geographic information or deeds that have been processed but have kind of conflicting results. So there's a quality control step here that has some manual interface with it. And then we automate that again with a Python script in this phase and bring all that historical geographic information and relate it to a modern geographic information that we get from the county. And then we get our output there is a data set of the modern locations of all the lots and parcels and plats where these covenants have existed. And we've updated this workflow a little bit with the new technology lead at Mapping Prejudice, Mike Corey, has done a lot of work to bring in some parallel computing power to speed up the kind of first couple of steps there. And while he was implementing that all, I kind of sat over his shoulder and pestered him to give me a really detailed process of what that looks like. And eventually he relented and gave me this document. So we walked through, basically what we're seeing here is like, instead of going through this this kind of Pythonic process at the top here where you're going, each individual document goes in and goes through step 1, then it goes through step 2, then it goes through step 3, and then it passes back out to another list. We've used Amazon Web Services to parallelize this and use some parallel computing power. So you get this whole big list as a batch. You drop it into the web service, and immediately we start running 3 kind of processes in parallel. And that sets out 3 different products at the end into these different bins. And Mike draws the garbage truck there. That's us, that we come by and scrape up all these big piles of data, beep, 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 and bring them away. What that actually ends up looking like is a little more organized, looking something like this, right? So the first process is in this, replacing the first step is batching everything and getting everything OCR'd so you can do that text review, and then you get this process where the images are both optimized for the web, and we can do this search process. And this has sped up the process quite a bit. It went from, I think, a 7-month period of creating this data to 3 days with this very similar size data set. So this is a quick kind of re-edit of that modified process, right? We get those document images, they go through the Amazon Web Service. It still looks pretty much the same. Zooniverse again, and then we've got this a new platform in a Django web app where we can kind of zip all that stuff together, and it's a much more user-friendly way of interacting with the data, and we get scores based on how much the volunteers' information matches, and we get scores on how well the historical geographic information matches to the modern text, and this is where we can come back in and do some manual adjustments and keep track, very importantly, of what those manual adjustments are. So this is kind of what the Django app looks like. You can see that we're getting various different scores, and there's a lot of agreement on the dates column, for example, because those are handled in a nice little drop-down menu, and then we get various agreements on what the actual text is when you leave it up to people to type word for word. So So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of like string comprehension in the background, comparing all the volunteer inputs, measuring them for matching, giving them that score, and we end up right at the end with our nice, beautiful, clean, super easy to use, of course, data set. And we package this up in several different formats that you'd be familiar with, like shape files in the Esri world, CSVs, and then make it publicly available. That's the other really, really important part of the Mapping Prejudice project, is that once you have this data available, right, it starts to talk with other data sets. And that's where the stories come out. So we want to put it in places where the data can be evolved, can be edited, can be in conversation with the kind of technical savvy people, the researchers, media, and any kind of data savvy person where they're at. So the end goal is this reproducible, well, one of our end goals is to have a reproducible product that can use Mapping Prejudice's format and resources to launch in other cities, and hopefully with the support of other libraries, as we're housed in the University of Minnesota library system. One of the major challenges there is to kind of address the reproducibility of the Amazon Web Services model. It's pretty technical, it's tough to customize. We need to, which is the problem with, I think, a lot of this automated technology, is you need to be able to generalize it. It's really good at doing a specific task, but how do you back it back out and make it good for everybody to use without too much technical knowledge? So we're continuing up with a couple of other, continuing to pair up with a couple of other municipalities to scale the work and bring the conversation of the communities. You can take a look at our information here by scanning the QR code that'll take you right to our GitHub repository, where it's freely and readily accessible. These pages will be continued to be updated as our data set grows and as our partnerships produce more data sets. And then it's also permanently housed at the University of Minnesota's drum repository. So you can access it through the University of Minnesota libraries there too, if that's something you're comfortable with. And actually bringing that conversation into other communities and making it open and accessible is a great transition to Emily, who's going to talk about the other big innovation of Mapping Prejudice, which is that public engagement aspect and the community-driven research. Emily?
Okay, thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm a little bit shorter. So I guess I just want to start out by also talking about my positionality and where I came into this work. So I'm actually originally from San Antonio, Texas, which is also one of the top 100 most segregated cities in the U.S. And I guess talking a little bit about my personal history. Growing up, I was living in a family, obviously, with very an impoverished family, I would say, but they were really passionate about giving me the best access to education as possible. So it was very much takes a village to raise children. So a bunch of my family members and my parents contributed to funding my education growing up. So we actually went to a private school, me and my siblings. And so at this private school, I could really see the different lives that the wealthier students were living versus the life that I was living, and just the housing differences obviously that they were living in was just something that was really stark to me at a very young age. And so I've always had that at the back of my mind, I think. And then also my parents, like I said, valued education a lot, so they kind of pushed me to go into the STEM fields. So growing up, I always did the free engineering camps during the summers and things like that. And then I actually came to get my undergraduate degree in 2012 at Macalester College, where I studied biology and art history. But then once I graduated, I was still kind of I'm not exactly sure where to go. And so I was working in a lot of community organizations. Most recently at the Science Museum of Minnesota, where I was working with a STEM program that aimed to get youth into STEM in order to give them the tools to address systems of oppression. And so I guess I was working at different nonprofits for a while, but I decided I really wanted to buckle down and like get my technical degree so that I could get a different kind of jobs, I would say. And so that's when I applied to the Masters of GIS program at the University of Minnesota in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. And I heard about mapping prejudice, and it really like struck a chord with me because of what I explained about growing up, and it just was a beautiful way to combine STEM with some narrative and like humanized aspects of like the storytelling, so that we could actually make a difference and address some of these systems of oppression and actually allow researchers to use that data to like lobby for reparations and different like showing different visualizations, which Kristine will talk more about later. And so Jake gave us a good overview of the technical workflow, but I just want to back up a little bit and give a little bit of the history or interdisciplinary origins of mapping prejudice. So mapping prejudice started in 2016 when the original team came together in the Borchert Map Library on the West Bank of the University of Minnesota to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American community. The original team started out with interdisciplinary foundations, so the team consisted of a public historian, a property record specialist, and GIS specialists. The team also added librarians because they felt that the decision to prioritize public engagement over scholarly production dovetailed nicely with the library's commitment to public outreach and service. It was also an opportunity to leverage the skills of map librarians. This project represents a less common, although emergent practice of librarians and their collaborators creating new research data sets from within the library. And then in this case, geographic context is really important. So the team had the good fortune of launching this effort in Hennepin County, which had already completed the large task of digitizing millions of property records. So it was easier to move on to the processing steps that Jake was talking about. And then second, as Rachel explained, in the Twin Cities, race determines access to housing. Oftentimes, though, Minnesotans don't see this community as having such racial disparities. But housing is super important because it provides the foundation for health and well-being, access to amenities, and the creation of generational wealth. So the project sought to make the history of racist exclusion in Minnesota visible to white people and ultimately wanted to illuminate the idea that there was nothing natural or immutable about the state's widening racial inequities. So some of the questions that they wanted answered were, where were covenants put into place, when, what did they say, and how many covenants were actually in the Twin Cities? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some other projects that were also digital maps about structural racism in housing. So in 2008, Colin Gordon created digital maps that set new standards for digital storytelling among historians and illuminated structural racism that was central to understanding the murder of Michael Brown by Ferguson police and sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. Segregated Seattle in Washington state had been galvanizing interest in how race shaped neighborhoods in that city, and mapping segregation in DC was employing narrative storytelling and cartographic visualizations to reshape community conversations around contemporary housing debates. All of these digital humanities projects shared a commitment to reaching a broader audience with their research, making their work relevant and readable to the community members who had been affected by this history. However, Mapping Prejudice innovated this idea further by engaging community and integrating them into the process of actually reviewing the deeds. Without the volunteers, the thousands of historical documents would take so much longer for the core team of Mapping Prejudice to review. In addition, the research team has found that a collective examination of explicitly racist historical documents has the power to create active learning opportunities for students, make space for community members to examine their experiences with housing segregation, and generate political will for meaningful change. So you can see that we have almost 8,000 volunteers, and the number is increasing every week as we continue to do our transcription sessions. Much of the transcribing work was done in groups so that participants could unpack the experience together and connect with others interested in grappling with this history. Mapping Prejudice holds the idea that maps, especially those co-created with communities through a participatory process, become powerful agents of transformative change by challenging established ideas, priorities, and power. So like Jake mentioned, Zooniverse is the actually crowdsourcing platform to host the deeds and configure questions that the volunteers will answer so we can gather data such as dates, location, the names of sellers and buyers, and the direct racial covenant text. With the help of volunteers, Mapping Prejudice has released both maps of Hennepin and Ramsey counties, and Ramsey was actually just released this past June. And Mapping Prejudice is currently hosting deeds from Milwaukee County, and we have the weekly virtual transcription sessions, so anyone in any locale can learn how to review deeds, because these are actually held over Zoom, so anyone can join. And then Zooniverse gives volunteers random deeds to review, and like Jake said, each deed is reviewed by 5 different volunteers, so we can ensure that we're getting the most accurate information entered into the system as possible. And then, like Jake also discussed, we review the volunteer submissions from Zooniverse on the back end using our database manager, and then we automate matching the modern and historic geographic information, and then where we need to, we do manual reviews and corrections so that the text entered by volunteers effectively matches with the join strings within the parcel shape files. And then here's a small example from the map. So the polygons that had deeds containing racial covenants are added to the map. This map is available on our website and is searchable for current day addresses so folks can locate where they are in relation to the historical covenants. Pop-ups display the actual historical racially restrictive text. And as Jake said, the data is available on our GitHub. And mapping these covenants allows us to start to identify larger patterns of where covenants were implemented. Oops. So our end goal is actually to have a reproducible product so that others can use Mapping Prejudice's format and resources to launch in other cities, hopefully with the support of other libraries. So this is why we've been refining and reducing the time it takes to run our technical workflow. Some differences exist for each locale that must be worked through, like Jake mentioned, such as different language that was actually within the racial covenants that must be identified and added to the search terms. As I mentioned earlier, we're currently working on reviewing deeds from Milwaukee County. We're having volunteers review deeds from this locale because we've partnered with Mapping Racism and Resistance, an organization housed out of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And then some upcoming counties we're also going to be reviewing soon are Washington, Anoka, and Dakota counties here within Minnesota. So Mapping Prejudice understands the importance of moving beyond affirmation of these historically racist practices to actually creating reciprocal collaborative relationships with BIPOC communities and tribal nations in Minnesota that can drive meaningful work to dismantle structural racism. This means making the resources of Mapping Prejudice and the University of Minnesota libraries accessible for community members, finding out what resources seem useful for people outside of academia, and then hearing from these stakeholders on how to make these resources more broadly accessible. It also means taking direction about future research from Black and Indigenous partners, stakeholders, and staff. Mapping Prejudice has convened a community advisory board to diversify the contributors to the project and connect the work more directly with non-white communities in the Twin Cities. These advisors have lived experience as BIPOC people, as well as professional expertise as historians, educators, organizers, policymakers, and media makers. Mapping Prejudice has also maintained numerous relationships with affiliated scholars who utilize the data in their work. Finally, this year, Mapping Prejudice was granted funds from the Mellon Foundation to further deepen these community partnerships through the creation of a year-long fellowship. Through this fellowship, 7 community fellows are developing projects built off of Mapping Prejudice's research that are relevant and meaningful to their communities. We're meticulously documenting the process of creating this program so that Mapping Prejudice can also establish an inclusive and replicable model for community and academic collaborations that add to the humanistic side of the digital mapping experience. The fellowship also serves as a hub for all of the disparate relationships that the Mapping Prejudice team has made in its previous years of work. So it brings together the Mapping Prejudice project team, affiliated scholars, library administrators who can identify University of Minnesota resources that could be helpful for community members, and the community fellows who can speak for constituencies outside of the university and who can bring what they learn from this experience back to their organizations. And then I just wanted to end my section by underscoring the importance of some of the partners that we have, specifically Just Deeds and Welcoming the Dear Neighbor. So oftentimes people come to Mapping Prejudice with urgency, wondering how they can erase these covenants from history and kind of just get it out of the picture completely. So to this, we wanted to reiterate that Mapping Prejudice is a public history project at its core, and our goal is to reckon with the reality of history and understand how it affects patterns today. But we do work with an organization called Just Deeds, who is a group of lawyers who work to discharge deeds pro bono in an effort to help folks feel more like their home is theirs, and to ensure that there's absolutely no way that the racial covenants could one day once again be enforced. And then, in addition to wanting to illuminate a source of racial inequality, Mapping Prejudice wants to understand the larger patterns that we live with today. So our partners at Welcoming the Dear Neighbor utilize the work of Mapping Prejudice in classes. One way they do this is by having students work through reviewing deeds or looking even deeper at the plat maps, as sometimes, although it's less common, the racially restrictive covenants might be located on these documents. And then also our partners at Welcoming the Dear Neighbor, as well as other affiliated scholars, like I mentioned, actually utilize the data and maps generated by Mapping Prejudice to make connections to current day patterns of racial inequities. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Kristine so she can talk a little bit about the work that she's done in that field.
All right, so I'm back, and they all were spot on with time, so I'll try and do the same. So now that you've heard a little bit about the map and how it gets made and how it's such a community-engaged endeavor, I'll tell you really quickly about our St. Kate's part of the partnership we call Welcoming the Dear Neighbor with a question mark. This comes from, so it's a Catholic college. The Sisters of St. Joseph have as their charism to welcome the dear neighbor without distinction. So our founding sisters have this as part of our charge. And we seek to sort of ask the question about, have we always been welcoming of the dear neighbor? And since it's not a mystery novel, we will go to the end and answer the question, and it is no, we have not always been welcoming of the dear neighbor, as you have heard from Rachel's excellent archival work and also the work that the GIS team has done to map it. So the interdisciplinary nature is sort of the focus of what I want to talk about here at St. Kate's and other universities who have been involved in the project as well. We have teams from history. I'm from economics. We work with sociologists. People in public health are very interested in using this data. We have people in data visualization in the art department thinking about public art in relation to this information. Data scientists, in fact, my colleague in political science is an urban studies person who was her student was one of the first to say we should bring this work to Ramsey County. So St. Kate's is located in Ramsey County. And as Jake mentioned, the initial work was done in Hennepin County where Minneapolis is located. And we're on the St. Paul side of the river. And so we worked to bring it with Mapping Prejudice into Ramsey County. And so here's the map again. And just since I'm talking about us as a university and where we are located, I thought I would zoom in. So we are over here on the St. Paul side, right about here is where Rachel and I do our work. And if you zoom in on that St. Kate's area, so here is St. Catherine University, and you can see that we are ringed by some of these racial covenants. And so this is why the idea of neighbor is so integral to us. And so it's also, we are working as not only with our disciplinary hats on, but also as community members who are in these neighborhoods and reckoning as an institution with our role in this systemic racism. So when I put my econ hat on, I come to this work like Rachel, not as somebody who did my dissertation in this field. I'm in fact a labor economist by training, Most of my work is about the economics of education, but I have found, not surprisingly, that there's a lot of overlap between studying education and housing because where you live pretty much dictates where you go to school. And so it's really makes a lot of sense. And in fact motivates my story about sort of my positionality in relation to this work as well. I, like Emily, came to Minnesota to go to McAllister College. I grew up out east in Connecticut, which is a very similar story in that it's very wealthy and yet very has a lot of disparities. The high school that I went to, actually the whole K-12 system, the public school system that I was a student in, was declared legally segregated in the 1990s when I was a student there. And so I think we think of legally segregated as something from the 1950s, but in fact, the schools in and around the Hartford area were so segregated that there was a lawsuit, and they won the lawsuit, and it was in fact legally declared to be segregated, which brings me to the idea that I benefited from the relationship between housing and schooling, and then go on to study the economics of education. And like Rachel, this is an opportunity for me to involve my students in research that has a very real and very tangible local connection. I sort of came to working with the team because Rachel and others had been out. We do a lot of these talks. We do a lot of talks, sometimes to academic audiences, but much more frequently to community audiences, in churches or in libraries or, neighborhood organizations that ask us to come and talk. And they would often get some version of the question that you can just summarize as like, cool, but so what? And sometimes the so what question is a little bit dismissive, like this is in the past, so why are we still stuck on it, right? Like get over it already, so what? And sometimes it was a much more well-intentioned so what, which was like, okay, this is in the past, these covenants were declared legally unenforceable in 1948. What should we do today? What does it mean? How does that inform current day public policy? And economists have lots of tools for that. So economists were excited to be part of the conversation to think about what this means for policy. Emily referenced before, I think it definitely informs current policy debates. We just went through, both Minneapolis and St. Paul had a big debate about rent control as a policy. There's an increasing momentum behind conversations about reparations and our understanding of the history, and then as an economist would want to do, to try and draw a causal link across time to understand that path dependency to today is really an exciting opportunity. So I will not bore you with a long econ talk, but I will tell you that my students have been using the data that has been generated by the citizen science kind of public history initiative that Mapping Prejudice brought to the Twin Cities. And the two main findings my students have to date are perhaps not surprising, but we see it very clear in the data that covenants contribute to a worsening segregation in the Twin Cities. Rachel mentioned before that if you don't think very hard and you sort of fall back on the narratives and your prior assumptions, I think many of us, myself included, had a prior assumption that maybe segregation used to be really bad but has been slowly getting better over time. And in fact, what we see in the data is that segregation was really bad and got worse through this time period when racial covenants were prevalent in the Twin Cities. So it is a policy that happens that is by design, it is not accidental, and it is not just because of people's choices about where to live. And secondly, to that question about connecting to the modern day, we've looked at some correlations between modern day disparities, and I'll talk about some of the work that we see that shows that covenants are very much correlated with disparities in upward mobility. So I have to keep giving credit to my phenomenal students. They made these nice bar charts. And this is where we see worsening segregation. And so this is using census data. It's using IPM's data. Shout out to the people at the Minnesota Population Center who do phenomenal work to make this data clean and harmonized and easy to work with. Draw your eye to the blue bar here. So the blue bar shows the share of enumeration districts in the Twin Cities, in Hennepin and Ramsey County, where there is not a single person of color, where every resident is a white resident. And you can see that in 1880, about a third of the enumeration districts in the Twin Cities were entirely white, and that grows to almost 2/3 of the enumeration districts by 1940. And so Rachel's story about how what's happening with covenants is that more and more spaces are being claimed as white only is very much borne out in the data. We're also really interested in a measure of segregation that was pioneered by an economist at Ohio State named Trayvon Logan. And he looks at a very fine definition of segregation, which is whether or not you live next door to somebody of a different race. And we love this measure because it's the neighbor. It's welcoming the dear neighbor and really thinking about who you're in close proximity with. And so here in 1880 in the Twin Cities, about 3% of people who lived next door to somebody of a different race. So not a lot. It is still Minnesota after all. But this does not improve. In fact, this gets worse. So we see that by 1940, only 1.5% of people live next door to someone of a different race. So this segregation is happening concurrently with the rollout of racial covenants. So then we like to, once the map's publicly available and the data's out there in CSV files and JSON files and stuff, we can work to overlay it on any other types of data. My friends in public health like to overlay it on health outcomes. As an economist, I like to overlay it on outcomes about economic mobility. So here's some data from a group out at Harvard called the Opportunity Atlas that looks at the role of your childhood neighborhood in your adult economic outcomes. Okay, so this is a measure of upward mobility. And this is data from the Opportunity Atlas. And you can see that the blue areas are areas of higher upward mobility, and the red areas are areas of lower upward mobility. And then my students overlaid the covenants, thanks to this publicly available data. And you see that there is a pattern. The way economists look at patterns is we like to run regressions. So for the statistically oriented in the room, we look at the share of covenants in a particular census tract and how that's correlated with upward mobility in the modern day. So the upward mobility statistics are for people my age, people who were born between 1978 and 1983, and it looks at their adult outcomes. So for people who were born long after covenants became unenforceable, we see a long and lasting legacy of these covenants on economic outcomes today. And so if you've taken statistics, your eye is trained to look for stars. And so you see that there is a statistically significant relationship between the share of covenants and upward mobility, but only for white children. So interestingly, we do not see a consistent relationship between covenants and upward mobility for black children, although maybe not surprisingly when you stop and think about what covenants were really intended to do. They were meant to make neighborhoods spaces that were good for white children, right, and good for white families, and they did that. So what we also see, the other star on the table there, is that covenants are associated with a widening gap in upward mobility. So a widening disparity between the opportunity that neighborhood offers white children and black children. So it's not an encouraging story, but it is interesting, and we're very grateful to Mapping Prejudice for giving us the data to be able to bring this story into this format, because it does change the conversation. So here's what we usually do. Here's what it looks like when we do our work. Rachel is with the microfilm here, working her way through. And then we are with our students, like Emily Stead, having them transcribe deeds, having them look at the plat maps, and it's an incredibly transformative experience for our students. It's an incredibly tangible way to confront systemic racism. I think we oftentimes talk about systemic racism as a theoretical, very abstract thing, which can very quickly get into, tricky political land. But when you're talking very matter-of-factly about deeds and people can see where it is on the map and they know those spaces and they've been down those roads and they can find their own home, it makes it a very different tenor to the conversation. And so it's a wonderful educational opportunity, and we're grateful to have this at St. Kate's. These are my students who are credited with all those lovely graphs that you saw earlier. Part of what they do is they also go out into the community and show people the maps. So here we are in Como Park. So Como Park District Council is one of our big partners. And let me show you where Como Park is, since you're not from here. So we're in the St. Paul side again. St. Kate's was down here, and Como Park is this kind of patch up here, where you see that there's also quite a few covenants. And so zooming in on the Como Park area, it's kind of an interesting story. So the OCR, the optical recognition in Ramsey County, was not as good. And so we don't think that that it is the case that there are only covenants on like every other house. We don't think that that Swiss cheesiness of the picture is in fact the truth. We think that probably because of the ad that Rachel showed you earlier, where Frankson said there are covenants on all of these houses, that there are probably covenants on all of these houses. But when we are at events like this, I just want to tell you a story. You know, people come up and they do this. They look for their house and they show us where they live. And sometimes they show us that they live in a house that has a covenant, and then Just Deeds steps in to help them think about what they want to do with that. But sometimes I had people come up and say, oh, you'll be so relieved. My house does not have a covenant. Like, whew, like they dodged a bullet somehow and that they were no longer complicit in systemic racism. And this was really interesting to me, and I think it's an example. I bring it up because it's an example where instead of me as an economist giving or using my data skills to understand the map, here the map is giving me something about reframing how I approach the question as an economist. So watching people with this reaction really made me think about who was benefiting from the covenants and who was lobbying and trying to make the covenants pervasive. So economists will talk about supply and demand. Remember this from Econ 101. Buyers and sellers are the ones who are engaged in a transaction that nets this deed, right? The property deed is an economic transaction. But when we think about this person who's relieved that their house doesn't have a covenant, I want us to remember that the buyer knows their race. They know who they are. They plan to live in the house. And the seller is leaving. The seller is not going to be there anymore. So they really shouldn't care about who lives in the house. And so the person who actually cares is the neighbor who wants to control who lives next door. Okay, so here we have a really interesting economic problem where it's not the buyer or the seller who's the motivated agent. It's what we would call an externality. It's a third party who's not party to that transaction, but is trying to use violence or trying to use legal remedies or trying to use policy to shape that transaction. And so it gives us a different way to think about the economics of housing and the economics of covenants. It also points us to our own history as a discipline where we see economists shaping this very racist narrative about property values, which is an oddly self-confirming theory that is not in any way based in the data. So we've been working on that. I didn't start my own timer. I don't know that Rachel did either. But that, my friends, is our interdisciplinary story of the history of covenants, all the hard technical work that goes into building the map, the effort to do a citizen science community engagement look at systemic racism in the Twin Cities, with a side benefit of making my work as an economist much more fun and interdisciplinary. We have questions that we will ask each other as a panel, but we would much rather have you ask us questions, and I will sort of moderate and kick those over to the panelists. So if anybody has questions, the floor is yours. Thanks, Kristine. Please. That's going to go to Jake probably, but go.
So, like I've heard you all project before. I talk about it with my students. Great stuff, and y'all do work for it. I'm curious. So I'm doing a project that's scaled down from this with city directory data in Athens, Georgia, and OCR, and how y'all got, because OCR does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of text recognition, and I'm wondering if y'all have any thoughts about kind of best practices with OCR with like large amounts of archival documents like this.
Jake, does it make sense for you to use the hand mic or to come here? Try the hand mic. Okay.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. Is this coming through okay? Great. That's an interesting question, and I'm not like super involved in the OCR process, so I might not have as specific an answer as you want. but I do know that moving into the Amazon Web Service framework and using their proprietary OCR has dramatically improved the accuracy. And a lot of the documents that we've been looking at in Milwaukee County, for example, they've got a lot of handwritten text. And we found that the OCR process with Amazon has been really good and actually has been pretty accurate identifying even handwritten text. But the major thing, which this is why we have the Zooniverse step, is because once you get the stuff out and do the OCRing, you're going to have errors, right? We know that for sure. And then we take that text and pair the image of the original document with what we think it is, and get the third party in there, the volunteer, the community researcher, to confirm that. And then we do that 5 times. And that's why that whole process, well, one of the reasons why that whole process exists is to check and recheck. Probably not the answer you're looking for, but that's kind of, that's what we do is build in a whole other step there where there's a really robust review.
It's probably too basic of an answer, but like some of the last covenants that we see, even after the Supreme Court makes covenants unenforceable in 1948, we see them into the 50s. In fact, in White Bear Lake, there are some in 1960s, and you would imagine that White Bear Lake gets flagged a lot by our language because white is in the name of the town. And so without the work of the volunteers, you might just think, well, OCR is just picking up white. But in fact, there are covenants in White Bear Lake, which is up sort of second or third ring suburb almost. It's more out in what would have been at the time more of a cabin area. And so we would have missed part of the story without that volunteer step.
Yeah, and I think the point about handwriting is also, like, having done some work with the census micro data, like, cursive is like,
That's another thing to bring up is, even though that we've recognized that the character recognition process is a lot better with the Amazon stuff, the very first question that you'll see on the if you interact with the transcription process in Zooniverse is this a handwritten document, yes or no? And if it is, we just flag it and we say, okay, we're coming back to this. We have to work out a better way of dealing with that, at least to try to get some form of automation on the review so that we can see actually how accurate those results are before we continue on with it.
I'm just curious from how many people had heard of the work of Mapping Prejudice before this session? So it did get quite a bit of national attention. Sadly, the Twin Cities were in the public eye in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and that fact that Mapping Prejudice had this way of thinking systemically about how race is working in the Twin Cities and housing was helpful in giving people a tool to understand that. It also galvanized a lot of volunteer effort. It also was the pandemic, if you recall. It still is the pandemic, and Zooniverse is an interesting way that you could do something from your house to try and help. And so they scanned the documents in Ramsey County with the expectation that it would take years to complete, similar to how it had taken years to complete the work in Hennepin County. And it was remarkably quick because the number of volunteers in the community who stepped up in the wake of George Floyd's murder to help and do something to understand systemic racism was remarkable. So there are some stories of resistance that are intertwined with these stories of racism. Kristine, who I will just make sure you know is one of the founders of Mapping Prejudice, and so she has let us do the presenting today, but she can answer whatever question she's about to ask herself.
This is a plant question. So if I'm teaching a class and I would like to incorporate Mapping Prejudice, the work of Mapping Prejudice in my class, tell me how I could do that.
You should do that. First of all, speaking from experience, both Rachel and I have had wonderful experiences, and it's like I said, it brings students to an academic understanding of racism in a different way. It gives them a starting point to talk about history, to talk about economics, to talk about sociology in a very concrete way. Rachel, you've been doing this more recently than I have, so your answer is probably up to date. I'm going to throw it to you to answer Kirsten's inquiry.
Yeah, so we've had, we teach a required first-year seminar course at St. Kate's, and about a third of our sections this year did a community engaged learning project with Mapping Prejudice. So their work was searching the Platte maps. So what we've learned by talking with other groups across the country who are learning about racial covenants in their communities is that in some communities, the racial covenants live in the individual property deeds. But in some communities, the racial covenants actually live elsewhere. They don't live in the individual property deeds, but they might live in the Platte maps. And we hadn't looked at the Platte maps initially here. So we have gone back and we're almost done with Hennepin County. I have a nice student who's going to finish up the remaining 150 left. And so we've been walking classes through the process of how to check the Platte maps to see if there are racial covenants on the Platte map. And it is really remarkable because I have both facilitated classes doing the deed transcription work and the Platte map work. And I will say my initial not fancy observation is that the deed transcription work is infinitely more satisfying to the extent that students are very likely when looking through a collection of deeds to find a racial covenant. And since you've set up, this is what we're looking for, the students like it when they find what you tell them to go look for. The Platte maps, I can make an excellent case in class when I'm standing in front of the room for why we should do it. But always twirling in the back of my head is, this is not the most exciting thing we could be doing today. But it's important work, right? Because in order to build the map, right, we both have to know where the racial covenants are and where they aren't. But it has been amazing to me to hear from the students who have been doing the Platte map work. They love it. Like, there are hardly any racial covenants in the Platte maps here, so they find no's far more than they find yeses. But they do really see it as a very tangible kind of thing that they can do that engages them in a project in the community. And I think that's really powerful work.
And as much as we benefit as scholars doing interdisciplinary work, they benefit as students. So I have students who are introduced to it in their introductory first-year seminar who then go on and see it again in a data visualization class and then maybe do research with me over the summer. And now they're thinking, about understanding what their future trajectory might look like and how this is the story that brought together all of their different classes and all of their different ways of thinking about the world.
I have kind of a technical question about, so I'm assuming when you find a racially restrictive covenants, sort of tying them to space. And you sort of talked about, joining in historical data and sort of modern data. And I wonder what really is the technical process of assigning one covenant to one location? And is that ever sort of ambiguous? I'm assuming it's like subdivisions and lot numbers and things like that. Is that a challenging process?
Short answer, yes, that's a challenging process. And trying to think of, because there are some very standard formats that a lot of these documents will use to record the geographic information, because of course, one of the reasons why you would create a property deed is to draw your boundaries and say, I own this land. So there's always precise information on there. It's translating it right to the modern equivalent that's the difficult piece. And to a large extent, that is left up to the municipalities that we're working with, because we get a set of boundaries for all the modern lots that will have some record of what the lot equivalent is throughout history. And of course, as those change, that chain can be broken and lost along the way. But that said, it's surprising. It works really well most of the time. But there are a lot there's a lot of hours that go in on the back end of this to look through where those matches don't match up, because we'll have like documents, historical documents that say, yes, absolutely, here is a racial covenant. It's been confirmed by the volunteers. We have geographic information from that they've transcribed from the documents that all matches, and we know it exists. It exists somewhere, but somewhere in that process of bringing it from the historical to the modern, there's some information loss.
That's a pretty hands-on process.
Yeah, so then we'll go back in and you can use, you're using a lot of contextual information, which is why it's a manual process, right? Computers are great for doing a lot of this awesome automation stuff, but not so great at recognizing context. So we go in as researchers and use that context to even just like spatial, what places that it's next to, and you can look through the records and go, oh, in this deed, for example, it says the northwest half of lot 1 in block 2 on the thing, and now the northwest half isn't a thing anymore. That's just all of that lot. So it's somewhere along the line, northwest half just got left out. So you can look back at the original thing and kind of there's usually some language in there that will confirm that northwest used to be part of it, and you can link those two together positively.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The economist in me thinks that when money is changing hands, there's usually a record. People keep better records around transactions.
So I know you mentioned like the molecular link. I don't know all the suburbs. But I'm wondering, like if you looked at like different degree or distance suburbs from like one city, if there are any like trends that happen as you move farther from the city, what sort of, if there's anything like that that you see where present throughout these original.
Kirsten, what would you highlight? We can expand. I mean, while she collects her thoughts, my quick thought is that at this point, it's just the existence of a racial covenant. And one of the next steps is to look at the actual language and to look for patterns across time and space and some of the details of how that covenant is specifically written. But we don't have that work to share yet. It's sort of in progress. Other patterns to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the pattern, and I'm going to stand here since I'm closer to here, right? This is something we talk about with our students. So, right, so this is Ramsey County. This is St. Paul proper, right, like where the tall buildings are downtown. And students will often ask, well, like, there aren't a lot of covenants there. What happened there? Well, the city's old, right? And we don't typically see here in the Twin Cities that covenants are added to already existing property. They're added to new properties, right? So that's not to say that like all of these areas were delightfully integrated and everybody was happy. There were other ways, right, that these neighborhoods were claimed as white spaces. So there's usually this sort of blank space in the middle, and the covenants surround as we see the suburbs, right? As we see the city expand and the suburbs grow. We can see it here, right? So you can see that sort of area in the middle is like Minneapolis proper, is the city proper. And then the covenants grow out.
We haven't done these, they haven't done the counties yet,
Right.
but presumably it'll be kind of a circle.
And part of the curious observation in Ramsey County is that we had anticipated that it would look kind of similar, that we'd find sort of the same number, but we don't. And we think that's an issue, again, with the data. So the scans of the Ramsey County's property deeds weren't scanned. They scanned their property deeds to give them to Mapping Prejudice to do the work. And their scan quality was not great. Yes. So it created trouble with the OCR, right? Because if the scan isn't a high enough quality, the OCR can't read it. There were, the OCR, at least that we were using for Ramsey County, wasn't great with handwritten deeds. And of the two cities, St. Paul is the older of the two, not by a lot, but by a little, gives you a little more handwritten deeds. And so we think there's holes in the data here. So that's part of the work of looking at the plat maps, right? So we started with Hennepin County, where the map's a little more assured. So it's a nice way to sort of check a process and see how things are working. And the plat maps are a place to look. Going back, right, again, this neighborhood in Como Park, it clearly is all covered in covenants. They just don't all show up.
Another pattern that some other economists at the University of Minnesota, Raja, Sood, and others have found is that covenants don't tend to be on the most expensive nor the cheapest houses. It's sort of an inverted U shape. So covenants are much more prevalent in sort of mid-tier housing. And this goes back to Rachel's observation that they are a selling feature. So they are a way to make a house that might be sort of marginal, like, but don't worry, it has covenant, so to have another selling feature on it. So land that was sort of marshland or sort of newly developed land when the suburbs were growing is more likely than like old mansions, to Rachel's point. They're not retroactively added. And ones where price is already a prohibitive factor and the exclusivity of a neighborhood doesn't depend on a line in the deed, but because it's just the house is too expensive for anybody to afford, we don't see them in those neighborhoods. But to Rachel's point, it is not the conclusion that those are neighborhoods free of racism.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing to that.
So the same economist, Raja Sood, who did this research that Kristine just referenced, she also did some statistical analysis about the location of covenants, and she found some of the correlations are close to green space. That's one piece, and we've seen that in the archival record too. But she said the biggest indicator is the proximity to the border of the city. So you can see, like, this is like a hard line here. This is the border of Minneapolis. And you can see that's the biggest concentration. It's just a walling off of the suburbs. And we think, so Ramsey County is much smaller than Hennepin County, and the suburbs lay in the adjoining counties. So when we do those other counties, we're expecting to see like there's a ring around Ramsey County in much the same way. So.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the historical legacy that allowed these covenants to be legal. Are we going back, is it Plessy versus Ferguson and separate but equal? How is it that it was legal to say in a covenant?
I just was working on a paper with this the other day and running through a quick history. There is a legal challenge to them where the Supreme Court says it's a private transaction. So the first ruling of the Supreme Court is that this is a private transaction that the government has no say in it. Even if it's discriminatory, it's private discrimination, and that the laws don't cover that. Kirsten, help me out here in case I botch this, but then that gets challenged, and there's a second Supreme Court ruling in 1948 where now they do say, actually, we were wrong. The state does have a say because the enforcement of this private contract may force the state to do a discriminatory thing. And so whereas earlier they had tried to distance themselves to say they weren't involved, they then recognize that they are involved in the enforcement. So legally, what the Supreme Court case does, we use that language, they become unenforceable. They do not become illegal. It is still legal to put them in this transaction. It's just that the government has said we won't enforce it. So you do still see them being added even after they become legally unenforceable, because presumably the buyer and the seller think that there's some value in having it there. So the idea that it will be enforced with the land and that it will run forever, right? The original language suggested that if I buy this house today and violate the racial covenant, that the house would actually revert back to the heirs of the original person who put the covenant there. That is no longer enforceable. And then the Fair Housing Act comes in shortly thereafter to sort of make these less likely to be put onto deeds. Did I miss any key points in the history there? Yeah, they become illegal with the fair housing. That's when they, yeah,
But
okay.
to your point about Plessy v. Ferguson, I'm going to need your U.S. history chronology. I mean, covenants predate Plessy versus Ferguson in the United States. Not necessarily here in the Twin Cities, But, I mean, the first covenant, right, it's in the East Coast, it's in the Boston area, right? And it's in like the mid
1840s.
yeah. And then you see like a lot of covenants on the West Coast, right, as you near the end of the 19th century, particularly directed against immigrants from various Asian nations, right? Here in the Twin Cities, this is why I think this 1909 moment is kind of an interesting one. So the first racial covenant in Hennepin County we find in 1910. So far, in terms of the work we've done in Ramsey County, the first racial covenant comes from sort of the early 19-teens. It's like 1912, 1913. And so I told you the Crocus Hill story, right, because I'm doing work in Ramsey County. But at the same time, there's a similar sort of story happening in Hennepin County. And I actually think one of the things that's interesting as I've been doing this newspaper work is it's as though the two cities are like having a conversation with each other, right? That they're watching each other and they're seeing like, oh, okay, so over there, a black family tried to move into a neighborhood, and here's what neighbors tried to do. So, well, okay, we're gonna try it over here. Let's see if that works. And they're developing like a script together of what you do when a neighborhood changes, when your neighbor changes. And I mean, it's terrible, right? But you can see that this is happening because as I've been doing the work in the newspapers, like the stories often come in pairs. Like where I can find the story in Ramsey County, there is often a counterpart roughly around the same time in Hennepin County, which I think is an interesting thing.
You know, I also want to point out, I mentioned sort of in passing that there is a role for economists in defining property values as a motivator here. So you hear a lot of people in the historical context say, well, it's not that I don't want someone living next door, it's just that I don't want the value of my property to go down. And so distancing themselves somehow as if this makes it better, economists have a big role to play in putting that forth. And I think I hear those undertones in that Supreme Court ruling where they're saying, hey, if it's gonna hurt your property values, it's your right to protect your property values. And so that idea of private property and its legal protections is a motivating factor for why I think the Supreme Court is delayed in their reaction to the covenants. Yeah.
I was like, to your point, so a couple years ago I taught a class on development of the suburbs, and there was a really, I think it was from U.S. News and World Report from 1948, reacting to this that was like, yeah, so now they can't have racial covenants anymore. Communities might end up trying to do this, this, and this, and it was a textbook like, here's what you can do, and it was like, you know, have it, you know, you buy a house here if you enroll in this country club, and this country club, by the way, is all white. Right, there's other ways they tried it, and then you also have like urban renewal and blockbusting and these other things from the country things, but like media and the role of media in propagating these things, I think it also really matter. One other question I had for y'all, you talked about like getting folks from communities in and trying to use these data. My experience is that generally one of the problems is like folks don't have, they're used to thinking about it like, where's my house and what's going on in my house. They don't have the kind of like, what stories can I tell? And I'm wondering what strategies y'all try to use in helping people think through what can you do with these data. Is that just like map it out?
That absolutely is how people come to the data. Like we all are like, where's my house and what's next door? So, and I think it's a healthy way to start. Usually then it's also sort of where do I work and where do I go? The sociologist we work with, he does a pretty good, nice job of asking people to tell stories about when did they first notice race in their built environment too, to think about like, when did you know which areas were considered white areas or where you were sort of as a white body permitted or not permitted or sort of comfortable going. And so asking people to think about those narratives, I've seen Daniel do pretty effectively. We see neighborhood organizations, some of which are the inheritors of the indignation type of neighborhood organization that Rachel referenced, trying to kind of re-establish, like rebrand themselves as people who are interested in anti-racist work. So having them think about their like institutional role is part of it as well. others, ways that you try and get people to think beyond just their individual house. I mean, Rachel's very good at reminding people that, please do not try to erase the history, but, discharging it is different than erasing the history. What else might you highlight?
I mean, my not very fancy answer to your question is that sometimes it just starts with meeting people where they're at, right? So I think about my students did a lot of work this summer with the Como Park neighborhood group, and like I started this summer and I felt like I was very clear about like the work I want to do is learn more about Frankson and learn about like he moves from some teeny tiny middle of nowhere town and shows up in the Twin Cities, and it's like all of a sudden he says, and we're going to have racial covenants in all these houses. I think it's so interesting to think about how did he know? How did he know that was the move to make in this place at that time? And that was what we wanted to do, but it turned out what the neighborhood really wanted us to do was do a lot of oral histories with people in their neighborhood. And it didn't necessarily answer the set of questions that I started the summer interested in, but it did create space in their neighborhood for them to talk about what are the histories and stories of here. Because, I did make sure that every oral history my students did came with a question about, what do you know? Like, did you know? Here's a map. Here's where the racial covenants are in your neighborhood. Did you know about this? And so, again, it's not fancy, but that's sort of
I think
meet
it's
you where you are, and then I'll take you one step
Yeah, and
further.
it's worth noting that, this is working with white neighbors, and
Yeah.
white neighbors are often like, what? I had no idea. And it's a different conversation than working with people of color who know much more intimately about what this is and don't have that shock. So, yeah, I think it's different. I want to make sure I have my moderator hat on. I think we go until 3:30 and we're past that. So if anyone, we're happy to stay. Am I right about 3:30 or did I make that up? Oh, good, we have 3 minutes. Don't go anywhere. We have 3 minutes for a couple of other questions. Yeah.
Is your work, I've been following the Mapping Prejudice project for a little while, it's great work. I'm just wondering, and I also know there's been for a couple lately over in Minneapolis over some, school district
Oh, yeah.
redistricting stuff. Do you connect your work at all with the high school district debates that are going on? How does that work?
I just met with my research students this week, and that's the task that I've tasked one on, is to sort of start thinking about the relationship between this history and school districts, right? And how do school district lines get drawn and change? I mean, I would say for us at St. Kate's, our work is, it's really critical to our work that involve our students. So we are not going to win prizes as the fastest, I think is fair to say. But I wouldn't want to do the work apart from the students. So I think this connection to education is sort of the next.
And I will echo that too. I mentioned before that most of my expertise is about the economics of education. So and if you're going to connect housing needs with modern day gaps in upward mobility, it's not that the words on a paper that nobody even knew existed, that are buried in the county office, have a direct impact on the outcomes. It has to be the moderators work through things like school boundaries, and then investments in education are correlated here. Or my friends in public health will point to some of the health correlations. So this is where I was very careful to say we just know correlations, but then obviously that sort of hop, skip, and a jump causal mechanisms. I don't have a slide to show you, and we haven't worked directly with the debates around the 2020 plans and the different redistricting and all that's going on in our community, but we are hopeful that by being part of the conversation and at least the background noise, that it helps people show up at those conversations in a different way, or maybe slightly more self-aware about how they present in those rooms. Well, thank you all for coming and spending your afternoon and welcoming us to your world. We were really grateful, and I left up a couple of things here. Emily created all these great QR codes. So you can do this, but you can also find our, both the Mapping Prejudice and the Welcoming the Dear Neighbor have web pages, and here are our emails. We love to talk to people about this. We go to small groups where 5 people show up and talk about it. So if you have a small group or you want us to come, please do let us know. And thanks again.